Welcome to Terror in Tandem, a podcast about finding entertainment in the macabre, hosted by the knowledgeable and lovable Laura and Richard Mathiasen. Each episode we discuss the horror genre, from books to film to TV and beyond. You know, sometimes even from the beyond. You can find us on YouTube at Terror in Tandem, online at terrorintandem.com, and on Instagram at Terror in Tandem.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, for the first time, everyone.
This is our full episode, not coming attractions episode of the year.
Our first fully themed, fleshed out, brilliant entry.
Like what you're hearing, I would love for you all to download, follow on all of your streaming. Listen, say that you stream us on Spotify, but you do other things on other platforms like Apple or Overcast or whatever, wherever other podcasts are. Why don't you give us a follow there?
Yep.
Why don't you download it there? You don't need to listen to it twice unless you want to. And
I recommend it personally.
You have a friend that has
helps with the digestion.
That has a Spotify or Apple podcast account.
Yeah.
Why don't you just
with
use their phone real quick?
That's maybe not password protected or easy to crack. Get
or
right
ask
in there.
them to, let me see your phone.
Asking, right.
And then you can just follow the pod. Just give us a follow. Or, write us a review of 5 stars only. And we just really want to keep doing this.
We would. And the support is helpful.
Yeah, we need the downloads, to be honest, in order to start to make something bigger happen. And we want to keep going.
We'll give horror for downloads.
Yeah, exactly. We will send Brian to your home.
Oh, yes. Yes, we have some updates.
Regardless
there.
of if you follow or not.
He's honestly more than likely already there.
Yeah. There he is.
Yeah, Brian.
So we're back with our international delights.
Oh, delightful.
And what are we talking about this time?
G'day, mate. Good on ya. We are going south of the equator to the continent that is also a country named Australia.
Oh, that's cracking. We're going down under.
Yes, perfect. That was... Did you little known fact that when it came down to casting Crocodile Dundee, it was Paul Hogan or Laura Mathiasen?
Yeah,
then
I had
Hispanic.
scheduling issues.
Yeah, it was... for the best, I feel like he was kind of typecast after that, where you maintained your versatility.
Yeah, exactly. I've been in so many things.
Yeah.
Just a shout out quickly to Henry, Alec, and Peter, our favorite Aussies.
The 3 greatest Australians.
Way better than Hemsworth's.
Way better. Hemsworth, Schmemsworth is what I always say. I always say
those
it.
are only worth a
constantly.
hem, and Peter, Alec, and Henry are worth an entire pant leg.
Well, we're ending the
Legs
pod there,
worth.
folks. Thanks for your support. That was
Peter,
perfect.
Alec, and Henry.
Yeah, g'day.
Legsworth.
Good on you, mates. My favorite Aussies. So this one's for you, dedicated to you, but also it's going to be full of cuss words because I can't control myself. But you're old enough for that. So we are going to be talking, like we do with all of our international delights, the horrors of Australia. I'm focusing on a kind of a specific area, but my beloved co-host is going to kick things off.
I'm going to talk about some folklore.
Nice.
Some indigenous monsters.
Nice. I love it.
And, I'm hopeful that because, we've discovered, or we've always known, that Australian horror really didn't have much of a presence in cinema until the late 70s, 80s.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm
now,
definitely going to talk about that.
I would say over the past couple of decades, it's really started to emerge as its own,
Absolutely.
force of nature.
Yeah.
Force of horror nature.
As the international popularity of horror has a bit of a renaissance, Australia has produced some real bangers lately.
So here's some ideas on what monsters you could possibly make a horror movie about.
Yeah, listen, your country may have been colonized a couple hundred years ago, but it's actually thousands of years old. So draw from the well.
So, speaking of the first is a amphibious creature called the bunyip.
The bunyip? The
Bunyip.
Bunyip?
Yeah.
The bunyip?
Bunyip.
I just want to know what to scream as it's eating me.
Oh, you won't have a chance.
Okay.
Head first.
Go.
It's from the Wemba region in Victoria.
Oh, Wemba.
And the bunyip was a malevolent force that lurked at the bottom of creeks and billabongs, according to Aboriginal tribes.
Ooh.
They were made to devour anyone who wandered there at the wrong time and are reported to have had horse manes, dog faces, fangs, horns, and are sized all over the place. Some people say they're as big as a bear.
Oof.
Some people say they're as big as a dog.
Honestly,
but they look like the predator.
A dog-sized, horse-maned, antlered thing running at me would be terrifying.
Think of an amphibious predator. The predator.
I'm thinking of it.
And they also have been said to make these booming, roaring noises coming from the bogs.
Bunyip!
They don't say bunyip. No, they're not like...
They're like when they jump out of the water, they're not like, bunyip! And then they get you.
I mean, I know you keep saying bunyap, but it's yip.
Bunyip!
Yeah. No.
Hadouken!
So, yeah, that's the bunyip.
That is that's terrifying.
The next one is the Yaramayahu. Yaramayahu.
I'm not screaming that. It eats me. Yeah.
It's another Aboriginal mythical creature, and it resembles a little red frog.
Oh.
That's in the shape of a man.
No.
With a big head and a big mouth, but no teeth.
Ah.
And it's got suckers on the ends of their hands and feet. And so it's a vampire monster, and it uses those sucker on the hands and feet to feed off of their prey, their, human prey and animal prey. And their mouth is so large that as soon as they drain everything out of their victim, they swallow them whole.
Oh, that's specific.
They're super interesting looking, though. Especially some of the,
even the way
drawn
you
version
them,
of them with the Aboriginal markings.
They're pretty psychedelic, honestly. It definitely makes me think like a shaman at some point ate a funky cactus and was like, "You guys, there's this frog monster. I gotta tell you all about it."
I feel like, sometimes when I'm laughing a lot, I could resemble a Yaramayahu. Because I get red faced and I have a big mouth.
Listen, as long as you're not lurking at the bottom of a creek, jumping out and going, bunyip!
Oh, boy. The next is the Yahweh.
Like Jesus?
No.
Or is that God?
It's Yowie.
Got
Yahweh.
it. Oh, okay.
It's an ape-like creature stemming from Aboriginal oral history. Similar to Bigfoot, it's bipedal. And is often called Hairy Man of the Wood.
That's a way better name than Bigfoot.
Yeah, I heard that Hairy Man of the Wood is what, Mark Ruffalo
let's just
shows in
Poor Things. Yeah, let's just let the listener make all of the low-hanging fruit jokes and, include the thing I just said as part of your joke.
The twigs and berries of it all.
Yes.
Anyway, they are believed to track and follow humans and then attack them and have been responsible for the disappearance of many women and children.
Like the woods aren't scary enough. There are giant hairy men in there taking your kids.
People that have said to have seen them report glowing eyes, a feeling of nausea and depression, failure of electrical equipment.
Like an EMP?
Yeah. And so also they leave some remnants of bioluminescence.
That's insane. So they've got this sort of like miasma funk around them that just like a psychic aura that fucks you up first.
Yeah, it's the down under Bigfoot.
I love it. It's way better than Bigfoot. Bigfoot was just some jerk in a costume. I mean,
I got a Bigfoot down under.
Crikey, it's Bigfoot. Listen, I have flooded my brain recently. I've watched a lot of Australian horror movies, but the last couple weeks I've been just gorging myself on them to prepare for this future award-winning episode. And
like a Yaramayahu?
Well, I've never seen any of these things or mention of them in any of the movies I've watched. And I'm not sure they've been represented.
Well,
So
there's one
get
more.
on it.
The Hawkesbury River Monster,
I'm
which is Australia's
already writing the
version
script.
of Loch Ness.
That's awesome.
And has been first seen 1,000 years ago. So it's believed to be prehistoric or, from the dinosaurs. But it was seen thousands of years ago by the Daruk people. And the beast is said to have a long neck, a large body, and 2 sets of flippers.
Huh.
And in recent years, there's been several sightings of them, and they say that the monster has a snake-like head, so maybe it's evolved a little bit.
Honestly,
or maybe it's not at all
anywhere
a monster.
but Australia, I'd be skeptical. But the common spiders down there are like the size of a Buick. So
What is that one that's like the black
I don't know.
wolf spider?
I'm already going to have nightmares.
It's like as big as a
Yeah.
donut.
I mean, they have spiders down there that like will stalk you, track your route. They'll attack your friends.
I'm not going to Google Australian spiders because
Empty
I
your
don't
bank
want to see
account.
those images.
No,
but you can.
did you
listener.
remember there was a time like a year or two ago where like a bunch of towns got literally flooded by millions of spiders, just washing over them like a
I don't
wave.
want to talk about this anymore.
Well, that's been the Australia episode, folks. Hope you enjoyed it. The thud you heard was my co-host passing out.
There has been also, before you get into your pocket of information, there are a lot of other Aboriginal and other Australian folklore stories that are ripe for the picking.
You mentioned The Predator and its most recent installment, Prey, which was an indigenous tale and arguably the best Predator since the original.
Mm-hmm.
There have been some indigenous Canadian horror movies made recently. There's been, Reservation Dogs on Hulu. It's not horror, but I'm just saying I think the time is ripe to bring some of these old stories to the screen. And the trick is do it correctly with respect and with reverence. Don't just, strip mine other people's culture to make money. But I would love to see some of these incredibly specific weird frog monsters.
Or to all the Australian filmmakers, creators, and directors out there that I know listen to this podcast, we're ready.
Absolutely.
We want to see some of these
yes,
Australian Aboriginal monsters.
Haunt my dreams.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Have some sort of weird, like the Tank tried to do, where you have this old property.
You did not enjoy that movie.
I didn't, but
no. And you were not alone in that.
Have them open up,
yeah,
this old area of where all of a sudden a Yowie comes out.
Nice.
So I want to talk a little bit about some real life horrors. So not monsters, but things that are like real, sort of more tangible folk tales
than a
monster,
than a Yowie.
The Luna Park ghost train fire.
What?
In 1979, a fatal fire in Luna Park on the ghost train ride, which is a theme park, took place, and sadly 7 people were killed with this fire. It was caused by like an electrical reason. But what makes this sort of a folk tale is that the Godson family, which was 3 of the 7 victims of the fire, prior to the ride, when they were on their way to the park, they were approached by a man dressed in a loincloth, a headdress with horns, and a mask. And he placed his hand on the shoulder of the 6-year-old named Damien, and his dad snapped a photo. Because he thought it was like a weird thing, and like a satanic weirdo coming up.
Yeah, sure.
No one knows the identity of the man in the photo, wearing the garb, but he is said to have been representing Moloch.
Yeah.
A god who has asked children to be sacrificed through fire.
Yeah. He's a big player in the Judeo-Christian pantheon of hell.
So people think that was
Moloch.
that
Yikes.
cursed that family and that ride specifically.
Yeah, so here's a parenting tip. If a man in a horn mask, dressed in nothing but a loincloth, asks to take a picture with your kiddos, say
Yeah, but
no.
that's our post-90s mentality. This happened in 1979 where
Nothing
it was all
I can
like,
do about that. Oh,
free-
well, in 1979, we were all our parents were taking pictures with men in loincloths.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like, you should see my photo album. It's filled with random men in loincloths. That might have just been my parents.
But that's just a weird coincidence.
That's fucked up.
I know.
Yeah,
They have that
I
photo.
don't like it.
The other one that I wanted to chat about is the Picton tunnels.
Okay.
In New South Wales, it's called the Mushroom Tunnel, and it was the first rail tunnel used in that region.
Yeah.
During World War II, the tunnel was used to store weapons and ammo, and since then has been reported to have a high volume of paranormal activity, with many people reporting suicides, murders, and accidental deaths.
Oh, God.
People claim the tunnel has cold spots, eerie voices and sounds, and a woman in white who whispers to people in the tunnel.
Was there something that happened in the tunnel, or do you think it's just the sort of negative energy of all those, objects of death?
Yeah, it might have been just the tunnel itself. Maybe it was
there's some
built
weird
on...
old history you don't know about. I mean, Australia is primordial.
Yeah.
You know, there are mysteries that will never be uncovered there.
Yeah.
That's
so
wild.
That's another one that people...
Don't go in that tunnel. Also, bad tunnel to hide all your weapons in.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know much about what
Pick
happened.
a peaceful tunnel to put all your bombs in.
It looks very scary. If anybody saw the movie Brick, it sort of looks like that tunnel from the film Brick.
Nice.
On
yeah.
the outside.
It looks like a tunnel you shouldn't go in.
Yeah.
Don't go in that tunnel.
It's most commonly known as the Mushroom Tunnel, and I guess
You gotta stop saying I can't.
there's access to it. You can, I mean,
Yeah.
you can,
You can go in the mushroom tunnel,
yeah.
but you have to ask for consent.
It was built in 1867, and it was commercially used to grow mushrooms, which is why it's called the Mushroom Tunnel.
Ah,
But it has all these like scary, haunted things.
well, that is some interesting shit about Australian folklore.
Yeah, just a little like urban legends and things to keep in mind. Little themes to look for maybe in future horror films.
Listen, we're
coming out
throwing
of-
gold out there for free.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. The least you can do is download. So I'm going to, as beloved co-host mentioned earlier, I'm going to dive into the birth of the rebirth of the Australian horror industry, which coincides with the rebirth of Australian horror films. Now, in 1971, thereabouts, the Australian government decided to revive its then largely dormant film industry with government subsidies that have continued to this day and have allowed for the creation and output of some incredible culture. So here's the wonderful thing about horror is when you this led to Australian new wave cinema and gave rise to directors like Peter Weir, Russell Mulcahy. It was the beginning of Mel Gibson before he was a big problem. George Miller. So the cool thing about this is at the beginning, right at the beginning, 1971, as Australian New Wave is coming up and getting into quote unquote, dramas like The Year of Living Dangerously and Gallipoli and things like that, Ozploitation is hanging on the underside like a lamprey. Now, Ozploitation is the cleverly named Australian exploitation genre. Now, for those of you unaware, exploitation films began in the United States in the 1960s, and they're just called that because they quote-unquote exploit the base desires of what people want at the time. So Grand Guignol Theatre is a great example of exploitation theater. Exploitation film is like Blood and Guts, TNA, Grindhouse, low budget indie. And I am describing it in a way that may not sound complimentary, but they make some wonderful films. So let's just jump right in. The thing that I discovered, because it's a sparsely populated country, there are a couple of names that show up over and over and over again, because this is a film industry that was created by like 5 people.
Right.
So Ozploitation, it sounds like a joke, but it created films like Mad Max is considered an Ozploitation film, the entire series. It's continued through the day into, you're going to be talking later about the Wolf Creek series. That's an Ozploitation series. So it is an actual legitimate subgenre, but it did have its heyday between 1971 to the late 80s. I'm going to get into, a man named Everett DeRoche a little bit, just because he was a TV writer who decided he hated what he was writing. He wrote his first ever screenplay that was produced into a movie, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then he wrote a bunch of other ones. And it wasn't until I realized after the fact that his name pops up a lot on the list of films I'm going to be getting into. So it's a small community, and it has a certain scrappiness to it. But like every International Delights episode, when we watch lots of movies from a specific country, you touched on this, you get a sense of what people are afraid of. And what I learned through watching all of these movies is that the number one fear, you mentioned other people, I think that's quite a universal fear, is nature.
Yeah.
Because so much of Australia contains the outback, which is largely inhospitable to human life. There are so many poisonous animals, so many ways to get lost. And the number one killer in Australia is exposure. Just stepping off the trail.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Because the outback is so untamed.
And it's empty. You can walk for 3,000 miles in any direction.
And water.
There's no water. Yeah, exactly. So it's very easy to very quickly die. And a lot of the movies we ended up watching.
And it's so hot, and sometimes the water that you do have evaporates.
Yes.
Very quickly.
A lot of the movies we ended up watching dealt with the innate fear of nature itself, and the people that are hardy enough and crazy enough to survive there. Is also a fear of the sort of city-dwelling Sydney, Melbourne, Perth types. So we'll be getting into all that, but you can't talk about horror without Ozploitation, and that is where I kept my focus in this episode. So instead of listening to me schmoan on and on about that forever, although I could, you want to take a little break, and then we can start getting into some examples?
Sure. Let's do it. It's that time again. Time for the return of your favorite everyman. Time for the return of Brian. The chameleon of chaos is back and ready for all the kinky, clinky, and terrifyingly mundane tasks you need him to take care of. After being swept away by local law enforcement on sealed charges, Brian has returned to a neighborhood near you. And while he doesn't need to notify his neighbors of his residential status, he will sidle up to anyone that has a side. That is only one of the many alarming traits that Brian has to offer. Surprise and lack of boundaries are his specialties. 'Cause aren't we all feeling a little lonely these days? Need an escort to the mailbox? Brian is there. Want someone to water your plants when you're out of town? Brian will do it. Need to dispose of a body? As long as the body doesn't belong to Brian, he's the man for the job. No need to ask twice, or even once. Brian will do the things that need doing, whether you want him to or not. Just turn around and you will see him. Brian has never been so close. This is a fake ad for a fake product and horror-themed podcast. According to the documents we have been provided, Brian has served his time. We do not condone nor endorse what Brian does that might or may not be immoral or illegal. And we're back.
Welcome back, longtime listeners and new subscribers.
First time, long time.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about folktales.
Yeah, so some of the common themes in Australian horror is, the vastness of the land, the mystery of the desert. And then as we sort of progressed through Ozploitation films, we started to look into the darkness of the suburbs and, Wolf Creek and Road Games created the anxiety of the endless outback and what could happen as close, like next door. You're just living your life.
And there's a lot of border towns out there where the law is flexible.
You mentioned nature, but also themes of isolation. And then we have some movies that explore social justice issues, supernatural horror, and, as we're starting to come up to current horror films, it's more like marginalized community of the aging and of people who are going through grief and through trouble.
What you start to see now in Australian cinema, I think, is as horror is, undergoing this popularity renaissance, critically and commercially, they are hopping on trends that are making money in other places. So you're seeing
sort of
less
out the outback, the unknown, the isolation of it, and now it's come back in.
Yes,
into
and
the
you're
real
seeing
internal experiences and people,
less Australia specific stories
and more human condition.
Yes,
stories.
Whereas the Ozploitation era in its heyday was extremely Australian.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of those films?
I'll just jump right in with one of the more entertaining entries into this. And it was the first screenplay of the aforementioned Everett de Roche. He was largely a TV writer for like cop dramas, and he hated it. So he took a holiday and he wrote a script called Long Weekend. Now, Long Weekend was released in 1978. It was directed by Colin Eggleston. Now, it wasn't a critical darling, didn't make a lot of money at the time, but like much of the output of that era, it has since been reevaluated as a cult classic and deserving of a watch. And as someone who just watched it, yes, watch this movie. It's a blast. So the short of it is John Hargreaves and Brian E.B. Hetz play the world's shittiest couple. These two people from the very first frame of the movie are insufferable. You hate them. They're awful. They're a married couple on their way out of the suburbs into, in a camper to go rough it. And you ever been on a double date with a couple that you can tell it's the last time they're going to be out, but you're with somebody you really like? It's that feeling. They hate each other. So they go out into the woods and they are incredibly disrespectful. On the way there, he chucks a cigarette out the window and starts a fire. They run over animals and just don't give shit. When they get there, he's got a gun that he doesn't really know how to use, and he's shooting it all over, and he ends up killing a dugong, which for those of you who aren't familiar is essentially a cross between a manatee and a sea lion. And for my co-host, it looks like this.
Whoa.
Yeah, so that's what he murdered.
Yikes.
So
that takes a lot of effort.
Yeah, he's a real fucking piece of shit. Anyway, these people, they litter, they fuck everything up, and the whole time they're awful to each other. So you're watching this like, ugh. You know who else is watching? Nature. And nature is tired of their shit. It's done. And when I say nature, I mean all of nature. So this starts small. Weird things start happening, like all their food spoils very quickly. Mold just starts growing over it. They start getting attacked by mosquitoes, but like a lot of them. Then vines start to block their paths.
Nature gets its revenge.
Then they start getting attacked by animals. A possum bites him. It's actually kind of a slow burn, and it culminates into a wild ending, into a twist you kind of see coming, but is still pretty effective, and then another twist you really don't see coming. that had me yelling at the end. Let's just say the movie does spend a bit of time setting these two shits up as being as reprehensible as possible. And that really makes the second part of the movie satisfying because nature gives them
a beast.
Yeah. And it asserts itself. And they're not in the outback. They're barely out of town. Like they're just basically at the beach. But they find a secluded spot. And this movie, like I said, it's been reevaluated. It certainly has an ecological message to it, but barely. It's really an exploitation film about two people getting fucked up by animals and nature. And the reason that happens is because they're so incredibly disrespectful to nature, but that message isn't prevalent in the film necessarily. It's there, but only because it's so obvious.
Yeah.
So, yeah, long weekend. Ton of fun. I loved it. So that's my first bit.
So, yeah, I wanted to mention the first Australian horror movie that I have ever watched.
Oh.
Was way back in the 80s, mid-80s on HBO.
The 1980s?
And it's called Fortress. Now, there's a lot of Fortress films out there.
So
it's not any of those. It's the 1985.
Not the 90s Christopher Lambert futuristic prison classic?
It's 1985 Australian thriller directed by Arch Nicholson, starring Rachel Ward.
Oh, yeah.
And it's based on Gabriel Lord's 1980 novel, Fortress.
I didn't know it was a book.
Yes. But it's loosely based on that. And that book was inspired by the Faraday school kidnapping of an isolated rural single teacher school, and was also influenced by William Golding's Lord of the Flies.
Oh,
so it's
I was just going to say, yeah, that tracks.
Anyway, Sally, she's a teacher in a one-room school in the outback, and she's got 9 pupils ranging from 6 to 16. And the younger children keep saying they see cartoon characters outside on the playground. She dismisses this. And finally, they see them. They're wearing Halloween masks. They're carrying guns. And they kidnap Sally and all of the students and bring them into a middle of nowhere outback cave. And they barricade them inside. What's really scary about this is, first of all, the masks.
Oh, yeah.
The masks are really scary. The characters don't have any other names other than the masks that they wear, which I think is interesting. Father Christmas, Pussycat, Dabby Duck, and Mac the Mouse. And those are the
called
kidnappers.
The avoiding a lawsuit mask.
Yeah, but also
no, this is Dabby
scary.
Duck.
Dabby.
Yeah.
What starts to take place is really the will of survival and trying to survive and overtake. But also, she never really stops being a teacher, but she does have to rely on the kids.
Oh, she turns them into child soldiers.
They turn themselves into child soldiers.
True. Yeah.
And there's this one scene that I remember very viscerally of where she has to swim. In the cave where they're barricaded, they find water and you can swim out, but there's a huge rock that she has to swim underneath to get there. And it is so scary because she has to do it multiple times because she's trying to figure out, can we get out? How to get them all out?
It's like
how to get the kids there because they can't hold their breath that long.
Like that scene with Shelley Winters in the Poseidon Adventure.
Sure. Exactly like that.
You know, where she's got to swim under. And
yeah. But it's really interesting. I guess that the students in the class learned in school about Indigenous Australians hunting methods, and so they learned some survival skills.
Don't they make like a tiger trap at some point?
Yeah, with a pit of stick knives.
Don't want to fall in that.
So it's just really weird as doing this research that I was like, oh yeah, I did see a horror movie from Australia way
Young,
back in the 80s.
impressionable Laura.
And I loved it. I think
Yeah.
I watched that film a lot.
Yeah.
Because it was really scary and really good and, you know, different than other films that I've seen.
Kind of reminds me of that 90s movie Toy Soldiers with Will Wheaton and Sean Astin.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just giving that a shout.
Awesome. You know, you mentioned school teachers, so I'm just going to go into my recommendation that is definitely the most important and cinematic entry on my list, and also one of the hardest to watch. So that is 1971's Wake in Fright by director Ted Kotcheff. And Ted Kotcheff has quite a filmography. Everything from First Blood, the only Rambo movie that's an actual movie, and Weekend at Bernie's.
Yeah.
You know,
Wow.
so that's yeah, and he also did the dope
quite a
80s
pivot.
action movie Uncommon Valor, which if you haven't seen that, check that out. So this was written by Evan Jones. It's a different guy. But anyway, it takes place, it's based on the 1961 novel of the same name by Kenneth Cook, and it takes place in a fictional outback town called Tabunda. Now, Gary Bond plays a school teacher. Now, he was largely a theatrical actor, and this was one of his very few film roles, which is too bad. He's very handsome and he's very compelling in this film. So he plays a school teacher in Tabunda, which is literally a two-building town in the desert. He hates it. He's from Sydney, and feels like an indentured servant. He's got one more year of teaching left before he can go pursue his dreams or whatever, use his fancy degree. So he goes. He's going on holiday by train to Sydney and gets waylaid along the way in a town called Bundinyaba. And while he's in Bundinyaba, or known as the Yaba by the locals, he meets the local sheriff played by legendary Chips Rafferty. Now, for our non-Australians, Chips Rafferty, when you have the image of like the ultimate Australian man's man, it's Chips Rafferty.
With a hat?
With the hat, with the outfit, able to wrestle a roo with his bare hands, that kind of shit. So Chips Rafferty plays the sheriff, and he approaches Gary Bond's character, buys him a pint, and stands there staring at him while he drinks the pint in one go. Now, every pint that Chips Rafferty drinks, he drinks whoop in one gulp. And the reason for that is in real life, the actor Chips Rafferty had no uvula.
Oh, wow.
So he was able to drink that way. And when they were filming this, the director used non-alcoholic beer because they had to drink like 30 pints. And in the first take, Chips Rafferty spat it out and said, "Oi, the hell is this?" and demanded that regular beer be put in. And when it was explained to him that he'd likely have to drink around 30 pints, he said, "And?" And the director said he never even flubbed a single line.
Wow.
No one knew he was drunk. I mean, that's the kind of guy we're talking, like inhuman. So this was sadly his last role, but a memorable one. So he plays this like aggressively friendly sheriff who's got this look in his eye like he can tell that this, you know, overeducated school teacher is looking at all of them like they're a bunch of, you know, yokels. And he is. So he can see the disdain, but there's that. Anyway, he is a very intimidating presence. Gary Bond gets drawn into this gambling den where he loses all of his money. He can't go to Sydney now, and he's stuck at the mercy of the locals, who are quite friendly, but they're also aggressive alcoholics and very tough to deal with. So Donald Pleasance, Dr. Loomis himself, plays local intellectual and doctor and debauched scumbag Doc Tyden. And he describes this in one of the most interesting scenes in the movie. Now, he says to Gary Bond, you know, "You hate these people, don't you?" And he says, "Yes, I can see through the bullshit. You know, I can see the false hospitality, the aggressive niceness. I can tell. Like, they're all just staring at me." And Donald Pleasance says, Well, it's hell to farm here. It's even worse in the mines. You expect them to sing opera as well? And it was a moment where I'm like, you're both right. You're both correct.
Right.
So this movie, I know I'm going on about it. This movie is essentially about this man spending a weekend in Bundinyaba and losing his mind. It is hot. There's no air conditioning anywhere. It is 1 billion degrees. Mm-hmm. There's barely any shelter. Everything is filthy. Everyone drinks constantly. I've never seen so much drinking in my life. The drinking is all beer. So it's just beer, beer, beer. Dozens of them in the hot sun. And then there's, of course, the very famous, and trigger warning for anyone watching this movie, kangaroo hunting scene. Now, this was not shot for the film. The director, Ted Kotcheff, discovered a group of locals was going out roo hunting, which is something that is done quite often in areas of Australia, and unfortunately to this day does still happen. Bushmeat. So he told them he was a documentarian, and he tagged along, and he filmed it. And at one point, he said he heard a thud, and it was his producer passing out.
Yeah, that sounds awful.
So that time when you saw me watching the movie and I was like covering my face and had a look of horror and shock on my face, it's because it's a real roo hunting scene. So that is both an authentic and important look into actual real rural life in Australia. These people hunt to make a living, but these are also the town's drunken assholes going on a like thrill hunt, basically.
Right.
So
that's awful.
It is horrible. Now, this is a Polanski-esque slow burn of a man who is changing as his environment changes. It's the degradation of a civilized man. So it's that kind of story. And the horror of it is really in the sounds, in the faces, in the sweat, in the nature, in the unfamiliarity. It all leads to a wonderful ending. And it has a lot to say. Now, upon release, this movie was loved by critics internationally, reviled by Australians because of the way it depicted Australian rurals as, alcoholic, roo-murdering bogans, which, okay. But it was then lost. The master negative was lost for until the early 2000s, 2004, it was discovered. So a shitty VHS was like passed around amongst cinephiles for decades.
Interesting.
And then they found the master and re-released it. And Wake and Fright, you can now watch it for free on YouTube. I can't recommend this movie enough. Understand what you're getting into. There is a scene of real hunting in this. So real animals are killed in this. But it is one of the most important films in the Australian pantheon, and it really does give you insight, and it's an interesting way to portray life itself is actually the monster of the movie.
Interesting.
Circumstance.
Very cool.
You're probably not going to watch it.
No, never. So I'm going to move out of your exploitation and move into some taken from the headline slasher type movies. Like Wolf Creek.
Filmed and produced in Adelaide.
So Wolf Creek, The Killing Ground, those are all realistic, focused on real violent occurrences. Australian horror films like The Nightingale and Road Games also talk about the harsh nature.
Are you talking Road Games with Stacey Keach and Jamie Lee Curtis?
Yeah.
I fucking love that movie.
Yeah. And so they also talk about some of the social issues within the Australian social sphere, as I mentioned earlier. I do want to talk briefly about this middling place of horror in Australia, which is really exploring travelers broken down in the desert, and then things get bad. So with Mick Taylor and Wolf Creek, that's based on the real crimes of Ivan Millett and Bradley Murdoch.
The backpack murders.
Yeah. And so it's pretty significant because that took place. And I know a lot of Australians had problems with it because it's really just a retelling of horrible real life incidences.
It's also quite an extreme series of films.
Yeah, it's, to be honest, it's these backpackers were serial killers.
No, the backpackers were victims.
Of the sailor.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is Greg McLean's Wolf Creek. Released
Director
in 2000.
Of one of your favorites, your croc recommendation, Rogue.
Yeah. So released in 2005, and it's set in the outback. And it's got a lot of torture, a lot of gore, and it's really bleak. And a lot of people really, really loved it. The killer himself is insane. He's out of his mind, and it's sort of like that psychological unraveling that you're seeing into actual brutal murdering. The other based on a real...
I mean, listen, this movie is carried by John Jarrett, who plays Mick Taylor, the killer.
Yeah.
The reason why such a bleak, violent slasher movie is so unbelievably entertaining to watch for those of us that are, deviant pervs who are into this kind of shit, is because he is unbelievably compelling. Now, he plays a woman-hating, narcissistic, racist, xenophobic piece of shit, but he's so charismatic.
Yeah, he welcomes them in with his weird charm.
Yeah, at first you're like, oh, who's this weird guy? And then you get hints throughout the conversation of like, uh-oh. Yeah. And then he's, wrapping chains around you. And
so the next one that's based on real happenings is the Snowden murders.
Yes.
That came out in 2011. It's what's really sad is this case actually happened in 1999. Police in Snowtown. I mean, I don't know if it's Snowden or Snowtown. Australia made a discovery when they found 8 barrels containing bodies in an old bank vault. It quickly became known as Bodies in the Barrel murders, and then
That's
later
clever.
the Snowton murders.
Okay.
The killings were eventually found out to be perpetrated by John Bunting, Robert Wagner, not that Robert Wagner.
No, not
James Velasquez, and Mark Hayden. They had all worked together as a team of serial killers for years, killing lots of people. Who knows if these are all the bodies? The police investigation determined Bunting and the other men had murdered at least 12 people. Many were men, and they were tortured before their death. And so this film is based on the true events. 16-year-old Jamie falls in with his mother's new boyfriend and his crowd of self-appointed neighborhood watchmen. And then that leads to a killing spree of torture and murder. So it's a very dark film. It's a very slow burn, but like really methodical. You can see how somebody could be tied up in a situation of where now they've done it or now they've been part of it, and so they might as well see it through because the only alternative is death.
Oh, sure. Inertia. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But that's, sort of, I would say, in this area, it's the leaving behind of the Ozploitation. And it's more of exploring the outback and the people that are unknown monsters,
Yeah.
We haven't really gotten the Aussie monsters other than the crocs and some of the like shark attacks and those types of films. But these are like the human monsters that exist.
Yeah, I mean, when 90% of your country is the outback, you start wondering who lives out there.
Yeah. That's
awesome. I'm sticking with Ozploitation. Now, you already mentioned Road Games, which I want to briefly. That's another Evan DeRoche written script directed by Richard Franklin. It came out in 1981. Notably, it's rated PG. It's pretty tame in the violence department, and it's a lot of fun because Stacy Keach is so watchable in this movie as a truck driver with a real poet's personality who talks to himself and invents games. That he invents a story about this guy in a van that he keeps seeing
to pass the time on his long trips.
And it turns out he's right. This guy, there's a series of women that have been murdered, and it's a lot of fun because, like I said, it's not very violent, and it's a gas to see Stacy Keach so young, and also Jamie Lee Curtis pops up. 1981 Jamie Lee Curtis. So I'm gonna go talk real quick about another side of that. It's another Richard Franklin, Evan DeRoche film. Now, I'm talking 1978's Patrick. Now, Everett DeRoche. Now, this is definitely the most absurd movie on my list. Patrick is the titular Patrick murdered his mother and his mother's lover by throwing they were in the bathtub together, and I threw a toaster in there.
Wow, that's...
Yeah.
That old toaster.
And
trick.
ever since then, that's a hell of a way to open a movie, by the way. This movie has two things going for it. The opening and the ending are both, woo, it's bookended. So ever since then, Patrick has been catatonic. He's been in a coma with his eyes open, and he's real weird. So flash forward to this new nurse, taking care of Patrick, and she starts to notice that Patrick communicates with her. He spits on her. At first, and then he starts doing things with his mind, like leaving her notes with a typewriter. And then he starts killing people with his mind. Yeah,
Hartsfield.
Pretty much exactly the same thing. Like he kills people with his brain.
Yeah.
But it's a silly movie. It's very 70s, and it's very Australian 70s, which is, it's just as brown as American 70s was, just as many shag carpets, but it's kind of fun. It's got, like a real swinging pool party scene in it. Now, the last movie I'm going to talk about is, just real quick, is 1984's Razorback. And I'm mentioning this because it's a ton of fun. It is director Russell Mulcahy's, if not his first film, definitely like his earliest. This is before he directed Highlander. And it is another script by Everett DeRoche. Now, I feel like in my list, I've gone through cerebral, psychological, man versus nature, all that kind of stuff. This is just my straight up silly good time. Razorback is the titular Razorback. It's a kind of boar. Mm-hmm. Now, this boar is giant. And in the literal first scene of this movie, it runs through a house. I mean, through the wall, through a house, grabs a kid, runs out the back, and that's the first scene of the movie.
Wow.
So Bill Kerr plays this awesome Australian Captain Ahab that's like basically dedicated its life to hunting this Razorback that got his grandson. An American journalist comes to investigate, stories of like bushmeat and roo killings and things like that, and ends up on this story. Her husband gets involved. It's got a couple of characters in there that are straight up lifted out of Mad Max, and that's because this came out, I think, the same year as the first Mad Max came out. So it's definitely capitalizing on the popularity there, because it's like two weird punk rock, dirty, never brush their teeth in their lives Australians, and you're like, okay. And they wear goggles, and they act like they should be in a Mad Max movie. But Razorback is hilarious because the animatronic like never worked. So the strength of it forced Russell Mulcahy to use like perspective shots or to shoot around it. And that actually works in this film's favor because it makes this thing seem scarier than it is. I'd rather see the implication of something than something that looks like shit.
Yeah, I think always when you finally see like the creepy monster, sometimes in the light, it's not as scary.
That's the thing. When you do kind of see this thing at the end, you're like, well, all right, it was scarier when you couldn't see it, but it was still wreaking havoc. That to me was more frightening. So Razorback from 1984 is a ton of fun. It's the most punk rock movie on my list. It's dumb as shit for sure. But if you want to watch, giant boars that are like Terminator monsters, it's so much fun. This movie kind of rules, honestly.
So I'm talked about how the progression of Australian horror has gone from, I mean, what you mentioned, exploitation, to, the fears of isolation and the outback and the, the real human nature of evil. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about more contemporary Australian horror and with its themes of grief and
it's gotten a lot more supernatural.
Like dealing with becoming old.
Yeah.
And, so the three movies that I just want to mention is Babadook, which from
Jennifer
2014. Kent. Yeah. The actual Babadook monster was created by artist Alexander Juhas, who I follow on Instagram, and he's got incredible art.
Oh, yeah, his work's amazing.
I highly recommend.
And the best part of all this
him.
is that the Babadook has since become like a gay icon.
Yeah, it's a dark shadow in the shape of a man with piercing white eyes, a long black coat, a top hat, and arms that extend far beyond the reach of any human. And so the film essentially deals with, as you mentioned earlier, postpartum depression or post-loss depression, single motherhood,
and
issues of
raising
grief,
a kid that is tough,
very tough, and doing it alone and feeling isolated, but in a very urban neighborhood,
and also the societal inability to express any of that as a woman. Like, you can't just come out and say, I'm enraged, I'm angry, I hate my kids today.
And A24 is a really good receptacle for quality films and quality horror films, and Sydney-based Causeway Films, which is where the Babadook, Cargo, Talk to Me, they all
Cargo was
have
so
come out
good.
of this production
You want to see
company.
Tim from the original Office in a zombie movie?
Yeah.
Of course you do. Of course you do.
So the other one is Relic from 2020, which follows the disappearance of an elderly mother and her daughter and granddaughter come to this like decaying country home where she's lived most of her life. Dementia has started to set in. She comes back, doesn't have any interest in telling them where she's been. Maybe she doesn't even know. And it's essentially a haunted house movie.
I didn't think you were going to like it.
It was gross.
I loved it.
It was really frightening because a prior family member or a family member that has dementia opens up the ability for horror to come in.
Yeah.
It was just a really like sad and interesting perspective.
Such a great reflection.
There weren't jump scares or anything like that. It was just really a slow, intentional movie about decay.
Listen, as somebody who's going through it at the moment, aging all on its own is its own fucking horror movie.
But like decayed relationships, decay of the home, decay of the mind.
Yeah, rot was a big thing in this movie.
Yeah. And then the final one is Talk to Me, which we've talked about. So I'm not going to get into it too much, but this
Can I get a
Australian YouTube stars turned
Raka,
feature
raka.
film directors created this, and Danny and Michael Filippo. So I think that, they got high accolades at Sundance. We watched it. We talked about it. We loved it. Again, it's talking about how when you are vulnerable, sometimes things can be open portals, and this obsession of being part of something.
That's what every church
peer
says.
Pressure. It's like the new peer pressure.
You have to follow our rules or you open yourself up to danger or possession.
And obviously it was a spiritual. This is more supernatural. All of these are really supernaturally based. But it's really interesting to look at because the character of Maya, she was vulnerable.
Oh, yeah.
And really wanted to cut those boundaries between the real and spiritual worlds.
Demons, military recruiters, and priests all use the same recruiting tactics.
And then I just want to throw this last one in here because I just watched it. came out in 2022, called Sissy, and it stars Aisha D as Cecilia, who used to be called Sissy, but was also called a sissy and had outbursts of violence that, as a young girl, that impacted future relationships. But the most important thing is this person is a social media influencer. The character is a social media influencer who very much in front of the camera seems at peace and together. And even in the first moments of the film, you cut to her real life where her sink is filled with dirty dishes, where her
that's
life
not all
is
authentic?
a complete mess. And so she goes to this hen's weekend with one of her old friends and a woman that she had perpetuated violence on when she was just a little girl, said it was an accident. She keeps playing it over in her mind. Things start to fall apart, and this turns into a very campy, terrifying slasher. But I want to say one really crazy scene is she basically buries the body of someone and lays down near it and does an Insta live, just telling everybody, I'm in nature and I just want you all to remember you are enough. Like,
amazing.
Never had, like, can totally turn.
Yeah. Just sociopath.
And it's just how impeccably she keeps her online image perfect, like to the extent that she'll go to. And then everything that happens, it's a really interesting, fun, modern, millennial film.
Come into a lot of horror movies.
Yeah.
Hatching from last year was a big deal.
That movie Sick.
Influencer.
Yep. They're all, I just want to see where this is going. You know, I think with Talk to Me, we saw that a little bit too with the TikTok and, you know, this challenge influencing these this like game that they were playing. So I'm hoping that it'll go more and more into this, but also I'm hoping that we'll see some of these folklore monsters represented.
We always say this in international episodes that when you watch enough horror from a specific place, you get a sense of what frightens a people. But the other thing that I got, it was just pervasive in every movie I watched, no matter how bleak, no matter how dark, Australian sense of humor cannot be escaped. It cannot be separated. Now, there are plenty of American films, British films, that are just bleak, that there is not even a single moment of levity to break things up. That seems to be impossible in Australian films. Even Wake in Fright, even Wolf Creek, there are moments that are legitimately, if not ha-ha funny, but humorous. And I think it just speaks to the national character. You know, I think there's that sort of exaggerated version of Australians that we have based on, you know, like Crocodile Dundee, but it does speak to the national character. I'll never forget watching, and from my family, I gather this is quite common, watching an interview with an Australian police officer that had been chasing some guy for like weeks. And the way he was talking about it, he's like, yeah, you know, he gave us a fair go, but in the end we got him. You know, we did all jobs. And in America, you think like they use words like war and we're at war with these monsters and these evildoers and blah, blah, blah. And is this sense of like, you know, his job's to be a criminal, mine's to be a cop. And in the end, I won. And it was like no hard feelings. And I got that sense throughout watching these Australian movies, was that wonderful national character. You can make the darkest horror movie possible. You can't pull that out. You just can't. Mm-hmm. And it lends a certain joy and also like a watermark. You can tell it's an Australian film, even without the accents, just based on the vibe.
Yeah, for sure. I think they're all great.
Well, that's been international.
Except for the one that you talked about.
Wake and Fright.
Kangaroo. Yeah.
It's a hard movie to watch, but I can't stress it enough. It's a masterpiece. It really is. Well, that's been International Delights Australia.
Yeah, we hope you learned a little and got interested in a lot.
This here's the wattle, the emblem of our land. You can put it in a bottle. You can hold it in your hand.
Like and subscribe.
Yeah, please do. And have a wonderful week, everybody.
Bye.
Terror in Tandem is written, produced, and recorded by Laura and Richard Mathiasen, and edited and mixed by Richard Mathiasen. Our theme was written and performed by Carrie Denver, and all other music was written and performed by David Suspanic. All opinions expressed on this podcast are our own and should be taken as such. Thanks for listening, and please remember to give us a like, a review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time. We're standing right behind you.